So it's my pleasure to introduce to this evening James Bruce, who's been the first person in 36 years to actually give us a lecture about pilgrimages. And I was really attracted to this idea, James, by the way, when I was doing my research. Every year I research with people to ask to come and talk to us. And when I noticed that you'd walked to Jerusalem, it really struck a bell with me, because when I was about 19 years old, I lived in a house in Reading full of Christian students, and one of them had walked to Jerusalem. So that's why I thought I was really grabbed by your story. I'm really looking forward to hearing about your adventures in some of the footsteps of Livingstone. So, without any further ado, I will hand over to you, James. Where are you?
All right. Okay, so right, here we go. Thank you, Steve, very much for your introduction. To mark the bicentenary of his birth in 2013, Professor of Biochemical Parasitology Michael Barrett of the University of Glasgow gave a lecture entitled The Scientific Life of David Livingstone. He set out Livingstone's vital contributions to our understanding of malaria and the tsetse fly. Professor Barrett also said that Livingstone's published accounts of nature's wondrous diversity were received with the kind of awe that David Attenborough inspires today. That seems valid, but going further, I'd say that in some ways, Livingstone was a cross between David Attenborough and Indiana Jones. And indeed, it's often said that before Livingstone mapped the interior of southern Central Africa, it might as well have been the surface of the moon. So at a pinch, there's a Neil Armstrong element to his story. What really sets Livingstone apart, however, is that on his return from, as it were, another planet, he had an urgent message about the horrors of the slave trade he discovered there. Within a year of his death in 1873, his efforts proved effective in bringing much of that trade to an end. Arguably, this is what places him in the ranks of truly great figures of history. In early November 2012, I attended the premiere in Glasgow of this outstanding half-hour film about school feeding charity Mary's Meals, Child 31, now freely available on YouTube, by the way. It got me thinking about making a pilgrimage to Africa. Specifically, I realized my ultimate goal would be the community in Malawi, where the first Mary's Meals were served 10 years earlier in 2002. In the same year, 2002, Livingstone narrowly made it into the top 100 of the BBC's poll to identify the greatest Britons, charting at number 98. Then in 2013, you had this bicentenary, which I heard about on the radio in about the middle of February. There was a mention of Blantyre in Lanarkshire, where Livingstone was born. I was already set to begin my journey with an organised pilgrimage called Northern Cross from Lanark to Lindisfarne, so I googled Blantyre to see where it was. What astonished me was that most of the results seemed to refer to the city in Malawi. I'd never heard of it before. I hadn't done my homework, I just knew I was headed for somewhere in Malawi. But it turned out that the Malawian city of Blantyre, named after Livingstone's birthplace, is precisely where the first Mary's Meals were served. To cap it all, the Scottish Blantyre is only a short hop from Lanark. So I adjusted my itinerary slightly and came here, to the David Livingstone Birthplace Museum. The statue recalls a famous incident quite early in his career when he was nearly killed by a lion. This picture was taken on the 22nd of March 2013. 3 days earlier, on the 19th, celebrations to mark Livingstone's 200th birthday were attended by Scotland's First Minister Alex Salmond and Malawian President Joyce Banda. Livingstone was raised with 6 siblings in a single-room tenement in this building. His parents taught him to read and write, but from age 10, he had to work 12 to 14-hour days, 6 days a week, in the adjacent cotton mill. He was a piecer, repairing broken threads of cotton, meaning he spent much of his day clambering around the machinery and crawling over the floor. The mill owners were, however, a bit more enlightened than some others, giving their child labour force the opportunity to attend 2 hours of school in the evenings. Livingstone made the most of this and had a voracious appetite for books. At work, he found a way of keeping one eye on the machinery and one eye on his latest reading material. On our way from Lanark to Lindisfarne, we passed through Selkirk, whose famous sons and daughters include this fellow, one of Livingstone's most important inspirations for obvious reasons. Mungo Park, surgeon and explorer. Born in Selkirkshire 1771, killed at Usa on the Niger River in modern-day Nigeria in 1806. Near Selkirk, I was genuinely excited to snap this red squirrel. They're not, in fact, as scarce as they used to be, but I assumed they were still confined to areas further north. This may be old hat to some people, but the failure of grey squirrels to displace their red cousins in the Scottish Highlands is down to the pine marten effect. It's the focus of an academic paper which can be found online entitled "My Enemy's Enemy is My Friend." Being nocturnal, pine martens are quite difficult to see, though later in this journey I did actually catch sight of one in Portugal. And looking through my photos, I realised I also got a picture. This is the Drovers Inn at the northern end of one of the most scenic stretches of the West Highland Way along the shore of Loch Lomond. I came here in the company of Callum MacFarlane Barrow, whose son is Magnus MacFarlane Barrow, the founder of Mary's Meals. You may wonder what I was doing back up there after I'd been on my way to Lindisfarne. To explain as quickly as possible, therefore, Northern Cross pilgrims reached Holy Island, aka Lindisfarne, on Good Friday. The castle you can see in the distance is actually an outwork of the defences of Berwick, where I live. On the way here, however, my right knee started to give me trouble. I wanted to visit the Mary's Meals HQ in Dalmally, Argyll. So before long, I was off again, ascending into the Lammermuirs, where I spent a night under this bridge. A day or two later, however, my right knee threw in the towel. I came back to Berwick for a couple of weeks, eventually giving my knee the ibuprofen it needed for a full recovery. One of the things I had a chance to do was finish reading War and Peace. At the end of April, I made it to Mary's Meals HQ at Craig Lodge, Dalmally. In a meeting inside this shed on the right, founder Magnus MacFarlane Barrow told me to try to visit Liberia, one of their major project countries. The shed that fed 1 million children is the name Magnus gave his best-selling 2015 book, updated in 2021. So it's now called The Shed That Fed 2 Million Children. And speaking of War and Peace, copies of my first book about my 2010 trek to Jerusalem are available afterwards. It's a bit long, but half the proceeds go to Mary's Meals, and donations are currently being doubled by a group of benefactors until the 22nd of January. Furthermore, folks who buy all 3 handy-sized volumes of my book will get a free copy of this one, The Shed That Fed 2 Million Children, an ideal Christmas gift for the noble philanthropist in your life. In Dalmally, I spent a night here, St. Joseph's Cell, halfway up a pretty hefty mountain above Craig Lodge. It was very largely built when he was in his 70s by Callum MacFarlane Barrow, who you saw earlier, intended to replicate a beehive cell of a type lived in by Scottish and Irish missionary monks in the 6th and 7th centuries. Here's the vista I was presented with next morning. Actually, no, that's not true. This was a dilapidated barn where I spent a night on the Camino de Santiago in northern Spain. I realised we need to get from Scotland to Africa fairly quickly, but I must also say a few words about the dovetailing of another organised pilgrim trek from St. Simon's Church in Partick on the south side of Glasgow. That's me at the far right-hand side of the picture. Parishioners led by Father Woolley Slavin would walk to Blantyre every year on the Saturday nearest to Livingstone's death on the 1st of May. Reverend Woolley Slavin, 1940 to 2023. Father Woolley died in the summer. He was raised in Glasgow, but was actually born here in Bristol, in Filton to be exact. And here's a better view of Father Woolley's t-shirt. I didn't notice it at the time, but it's a variation on the theme of this one on the right. Homeland Security, fighting terrorism since 1492. That's useful for this talk because David Livingstone was a great believer in allowing indigenous Africans to acquire guns to defend themselves against hostile newcomers. It made him unpopular, for instance, with the Boers in South Africa. More on that later, but meanwhile, having trekked down to the southwest coast of Scotland, I crossed to Ireland. My policy was to sleep rough as much as possible, always on the lookout as it got dark for places like this neglected Forestry Commission hut in South Armagh. Sometimes I stayed in hostels and occasionally benefited from spontaneous offers to put me up. In southern France, it doesn't necessarily appear all that impressive in this photo, but this was a formidable looking beast, which I suspect could have been a wolf. When I saw it, I had a rendezvous lined up with a local who agreed with me when I showed it to them. The Western Pyrenees has a flourishing population of vultures, which I should have got better pictures of, in fact. This is a deconsecrated 10th century church of San Miguel near a small Basque town called Puerta la Reina on the Camino de Santiago. I couldn't help noticing that it had the same energy as this scene in the first Indiana Jones flick. Here it is again, and these in fact are prayers and votive offerings left by pilgrims. A nice panorama early in the morning in Galicia, northwestern Spain, on the final stretch before reaching Santiago de Compostela. Santiago, by the way, is Spanish for St. James, and this is the famed Botafumero, meaning smoke thrower, a very large thurible which hurtles through the transept of St. James's Cathedral at speeds of up to 68 kilometers an hour. A 5 peseta coin with Botafumero from 1993. This stamp in my diary shows I reached the well-known Catholic shrine of Fatima, Portugal on 3rd of September 2013. I had got into the habit by that time of taking photographs of all the pages in my diary, which turned out to be just as well. From Portugal, I came here to the Alhambra, Granada. This was the last Moorish stronghold on the Iberian Peninsula. Its capture in January 1492 was the final act in the reconquest of Spain, facilitating Columbus's famous voyage in the same year. Over the course of the Reconquista, the Camino de Santiago put Christian boots on the ground and was an indispensable source of revenue. This then is Africa. I did a fair bit of walking in Morocco, though I didn't walk all the way across. Never having seen one alive in the wild before, it's where I got this picture of a praying mantis. My first priority, however, was to visit the capital, Rabat, to get a Mauritanian visa. A Bristol audience ought to hear something about Salé, the settlement guarding the other side of the mouth of the Bou Regreg River, visible here from Rabat's Kasbah of the Ouidias. Some of the most notorious Barbary corsairs, known as the Sali or Salé rovers, operated out of this port in the 1600s. These pirates raided coastal settlements all over Western Europe with the primary purpose of kidnapping hapless locals who could be sold in the slave markets of North Africa and the Middle East. Not that the overall record of Europeans is any better, it isn't. But another thing to bear in mind is that throughout the centuries when Christians and Muslims were at each other's throats, the enslavement of prisoners was common practice. This was the historical context in 1434, when the Portuguese first sailed beyond the treacherous Cape Bojador, now in Western Sahara. When it comes to discussion of slavery and the slave trade in Africa, antagonism and warfare between Christians and Muslims is the elephant in the room. Most of the walking I did in Morocco was into and through the foothills of the Atlas Mountains to Midelt, which you can see on the right-hand side of this picture. Some high Atlas mountains are visible in the distance. In Midelt, I wanted to visit this Cistercian monastery, Our Lady of the Atlas, because of this excellent award-winning 2010 film, Of Gods and Men. Sticking fairly closely to the historical record, it tells the story of the monastery's first incarnation in a place called Tiberine, Algeria. When a vicious civil war broke out in Algeria in the 1990s, the community, all French nationals, had to decide whether to abandon their post or stick it out in increasingly dangerous circumstances. Eventually, Algerian insurgents decided their time was up. They were rounded up in the spring of 1996, and 7, now known as the Martyrs of Tiberine, were beheaded. So that's a bit of a spoiler alert. Sorry about that, but anyway. From Morocco, we come to Western Sahara. This is de facto Moroccan territory, but also a frozen conflict zone, making it politically as well as physically a major headache from a walking point of view. I might add that time was also a significant factor for me by this stage. I covered it partly in a bus and partly in a shared taxi. From the former, I took this picture of a flamboyance of flamingos. And there were some very striking views of the Sahara, but I'm afraid my camera skills didn't really do them justice. Not least all over the shop was this image of Mauritania's border post, which I had to snap surreptitiously as we'd been told not to take photographs. What I couldn't capture were the dozens of blackened car wrecks we had to thread our way through, some of which were supposed to have driven over landmines. Mauritania on the map. And this is a not uncharacteristic view of the capital, Nouakchott, on the first morning I was there. In case it isn't clear, that is a donkey pulling the trap in the front center of the picture. And this is a souk, a market in downtown Nouakchott. The blue robe you can see is called a boubou, and that outfit with the turban is very popular in Mauritania, a sort of must-have for the nobility of the Sahara. The Moors, who comprise 70% of Mauritania's population, are divided into Beydan, with lighter skin, and Haratin, Arabized black Africans who were their slaves. Mauritania has the dubious honor of being the last country in the world to abolish slavery in 1981, and even then, no criminal laws were passed to enforce the ban. Under international pressure, that changed in 2007, but there's general agreement that the problem persists and is significant. A report published in 2018 by the Global Slavery Index estimated that more than 2% of the population, about 90,000 people, were effectively slaves, and some commentators believe the figure could be higher. The Plage des Pêcheurs, Fisherman's Beach, near Nouakchott. The fishers of the waters accessible in these no-frills skiffs are all Senegalese migrants, whose standing within Mauritanian society is quite precarious. At the opposite end of the spectrum, this picture of the roadway leading onto the beach is helpful because of the three figures on the right, who just happen to wander into the frame. The Chinese, in fact, have a status all their own. above Mauritania's rigid caste system. And here's another less than really spectacular picture of the Sahara with a bit more greenery in the foreground, more typical of the south of Mauritania. So from Mauritania, I came to Senegal. The boundary is demarcated by the Senegal River. It's possible the name Senegal arose when the first Portuguese saw this river and asked local residents what it was called. The locals thought they were pointing to their boat on the water and replied in Wolof, Sunu Gal, meaning our canoe. For that reason, there's a sort of popular saying among Senegalese that we're all in the same canoe. I should mention, however, that I got a number of shocks on arrival here. The first being that visa regulations had changed since I'd researched the situation earlier in the year. Lacking a visa, I was told to go and find accommodation in the old French colonial city of Saint-Louis, a 2 to 3 hour bus ride away, while the red tape was sorted out. Quite a number of Europeans and other Western visitors were in the same boat. Football is popular everywhere, of course. Saint-Louis made a positive impression in some ways, but I lost my diary to pickpockets and was then hoodwinked into a situation where my camera was taken from around my neck. Having lulled me into a false sense of security, having been lulled into a false sense of security by a plausible older guy, with hindsight, I obviously shouldn't have been so trusting of folks who put nice food and drink in front of me in a back room in a bar. I suspect the refreshments may have been spiked with something, and they then mocked up a series of electricity blackouts. Mercifully, however, when I decided to give the ringleader my upmarket torch in return for his liberal hospitality, he returned all the stuff which until that moment I hadn't realised was missing. I should mention that elsewhere in Senegal, I received some authentically kind and generous teranga, the Wolof word for hospitality. I did some walking along part of the west coast towards Dakar, making use of this mosquito tent thing. But it was much more difficult to sleep rough in Africa than in Europe. Derelict buildings are likely to be either occupied or under some degree of observation. And of course, as a European, you attract attention. Although much of my time in Senegal was tied up again with obtaining visas, I made an excursion to the island of Gorée within sight of Dakar. Gorée was controlled by the Portuguese, Dutch, French, and British, each on multiple occasions, from the 1400s until the advent of Senegalese independence in 1960. This is more French colonial architecture, this time part of the fire station where I was put up for one night. Goré's fame nowadays derives from this 18th century building, the House of Slaves, converted into a museum in 1962. This door of no return, as it is called, opens directly onto the sea. An unknown number of men, women and children were loaded like livestock onto ships from here, and if they survived the journey, forced to work for foreign masters in the New World. Now everyone knows that Bristol was implicated in the transatlantic slave trade, but at this point I'd like to go off on a bit of a tangent about Bristol for a reason that is related but different. In Dakar, I was amazed to see a street vendor wearing a green and yellow football shirt that seemed familiar. It was the short-sleeved version of this Bristol Rovers away strip from the 1992-93 season. Both these players in the foreground are Bristolians, in fact, and both Marcus Stewart and Keith Curle, in the course of their careers, played for Rovers and City, as well as achieving great things on the national stage. My friend Severin, who sadly passed away in 2020, was a great recreator of celebrated voyages of discovery, who delivered 3 wilderness lectures on the Sinbad voyage in 1997, the Spice Islands voyage in 98, and Seeking Robinson Crusoe in 2004. The voyage he really should have covered in Bristol, though, was his most famous one. The Brendan Voyage, the subject of this 1978 documentary. This leather boat, the Brendan, was made as near as possible to 6th century specifications under the supervision of naval architect Colin Moody, who also directed the reconstruction of the Matthew in Bristol in 1996. Tim Severin and his crew used it to chart this course across the Atlantic. In Severin's own words, "I certainly believe that Irish monks had the technology to get across the Atlantic. There's no question about that. We've shown that conclusively by our experiment. I believe that the similarity between the experiences that we had and those recounted in the story of St. Brendan, we sailed through dense fog off Greenland, the tip of Greenland, where St. Brendan is alleged on his journey to pass through a great thick cloud bank. We encountered icebergs as well. And there are just too many similarities for it to be purely coincidence. One or two similarities, yes, but 8, 9, 10 in the correct sequence. The same things happening, the same experiences. This is, I don't think the laws of chance could explain that. I think the story of St. Brendan has to be based on real Irish voyaging, real experiences." So that's what he was saying. What no one ever seems to have remarked upon, however, is that the Canadian icebreaker that came out to welcome the Brendan when it reached the coastal waters of Newfoundland was called the John Cabot. The ship is name-checked in the documentary, of course, but the only visible evidence is, here's the only visible evidence: Skipper Les Evis presenting Tim Severin and his crew with a bottle of scotch and a carton of cigarettes. Here's Severin himself accepting the gift. And there's a reason St. Brendan's Sixth Form College was given that name. If you visited Brandon Hill in the late Middle Ages, aside from more red squirrels than you could shake a stick at, you might have been confronted with a scene like this. Cabot Tower occupies the site of a shrine to St. Brendan the Navigator, part of the patrimony of St. James's Priory, and under the wardenship of a succession of anchoresses. The best known of these was a lady called Lucy de Newchurch, originally from Hereford. And today, incidentally, is St. Lucy's Day, celebrated especially in Scandinavian countries, including Sweden. Back to West Africa. From Senegal, I came to Guinea. Senegal didn't give the impression of a wealthy country by any means, but Guinea is even more impoverished. When French colonies got their independence in the 1950s and 60s, they could choose to follow a pro-French path like Senegal, or an anti-French, anti-Western path like Guinea. In a town called Labé, I was scouted by the warden of this centre for orphaned and runaway boys. They've each got little geometry sets with Barcelona footballers on them, which I bought in the market there. Staying overnight, I also made a modest contribution that hopefully could have been of some use in such a depressed economic climate. This is fairly typical of the scenery I saw in Guinea. From the point of view of nature conservation, habitat destruction, sadly, is a real bane, as elsewhere in West Africa. Guineans love their football, though. They love their football as much as anyone else, though. Here, the guys in a small community are gathered to watch a European Champions League game. Apart from the screen, it was pitch dark, so when I took this with a flash, there was some consternation as they all turned around to identify the culprit. The river you can see in this picture is either the Niger near its source in southern Guinea or a tributary. I didn't manage to walk very far in Guinea, but as in Western Sahara, I've got my excuses ready. The week I spent in Guinea at the end of November 2013 coincided approximately with the index case of the 2013 to 16 West Africa Ebola outbreak. Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia were the three countries affected. A walking, talking superhero could have tried to cover the ground from the Mediterranean to Liberia on foot. But reaching Guinea in 2014, their way would have been blocked by Ebola. Using overland transport, including bush taxis and riding pillion on motorbikes, I was able to visit Liberia as Magnus asked. Some scenery in Liberia where I managed at least a bit of walking. This is one of the guys at what was a kind of Mary's Meals campus in Bommy, where there's a school for deaf children. The container bears the legend "With loves from Scotland," sent sometime in the early days of Mary's Meals' involvement in Liberia when it was in the throes of a brutal civil war. I've included this because in the centre it shows the Liberian coat of arms and motto, "The love of liberty brought us here." The first Liberians were freed slaves from the United States. Their capital, Monrovia, was named after US President James Monroe. In the top right, you can also see the Liberian flag, clearly derived from the Star-Spangled Banner. When I was in Liberia, I made a start on a sort of icon of the flag. Since I got back, though I haven't finished it, quite a lot of progress has been made with the write-up of the whole journey, and most of the chapter titles have a tongue-in-cheek Indiana Jones theme. So Liberia is called the Template of Doom. At the end of the talk, in, well, not more than 20 minutes, I hope, I'll read out what it says. From Liberia, I came to Côte d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast, but wasn't there for at all long. On the day of my arrival, on the 7th of December, I heard about the death of Nelson Mandela on the 5th. And this is just a useful quote. "I hate race discrimination most intensely and in all its manifestations. I have fought it all during my life. I fight it now and will do so until the end of my days." Rest in peace, Nelson Mandela. Another picture intended to give an impression of the scenery I encountered, this time in Côte d'Ivoire. Abidjan is the biggest city and de facto capital. I visited St. Paul's Cathedral with this stained glass that could be considered challenging in some ways. So you've got the French missionaries and they are arriving and they're kind of, well, France always billed itself as the civilizer of her African colonies. Mind you, this stained glass depiction of David Livingstone in Malawi conveys more or less the same sentiment. So then from Abidjan, I took flight. I had to fly from there. And what you can see here is really David Livingstone's old stomping ground. My plane touched down in Lusaka, Zambia, from where I travelled to Malawi. Amanda Mitchison wrote a book about Livingstone, which is aimed at secondary school children, really, but it has some very good maps, including this one. This was the trek that catapulted Livingstone to worldwide celebrity status. To show the modern-day countries he passed through: Botswana, Zambia, Angola, Zimbabwe, and Mozambique. Accompanied by a 27-strong indigenous African guard loaned to him by Sekeletu, a chief with whom he was on excellent terms, Livingstone jumped from Linyanti in modern-day Botswana to Luanda in Portuguese Angola, then retraced his steps and made it via the Victoria Falls all the way to Quilimane in Portuguese Mozambique. The figures here denote the slave caravans Livingstone encountered. Every year in the 18th and 19th centuries, Arab traders brought tens of thousands of Africans to be sold at Zanzibar's Stone Town slave market off the east coast. When the trans-Saharan routes to Egypt and Morocco are taken into account, it's estimated that as many as 17 million Africans were enslaved, and those who survived the brutal journey from the interior were probably the minority. Meanwhile, though, Royal Geographical Society President Sir Roderick Murchison described this trek as the greatest triumph in geographical research which has been affected in our times. Its success was down to a number of factors, of which perhaps the most important was Livingstone's pioneering use of quinine as a preventive medication for malaria. It's said he would have died hundreds of times over without it. Another essential ingredient, however, was Livingstone's unbelievable courage. Sir John Kirk, one of his most capable British-Scottish associates, put it like this: his absolute lack of any sense of fear amounted almost to a weakness. He would go into the most perilous situations without a tremor or a touch of hesitation. You can see, in fact, that a Briton like Kirk might well have misgivings about this personality trait, whereas to Africans it was the underpinning of his legendary status. That is actually reflected in the often extremely acrimonious relationships Livingstone had with Europeans on his later expeditions, in contrast with his generally good relations with indigenous Africans. Although the Zambezi was almost at its lowest level when I got to the Zambian side of the Victoria Falls, it was still an impressive spectacle. Livingstone arrived here in November 1855. Understandably, he gets some stick for bestowing the name Victoria Falls. It smacks of imperialism, obviously, and that isn't a charge Livingstone could easily duck. But the fact is that he was an imperialist with an extraordinary reverence and appreciation for native traditions and languages. That's why I think this illustration is helpful from Livingstone's 1857 book, Missionary Travels and Researches in South Africa. Throughout, and in the caption to this picture, he uses the indigenous name Mosi Oatunya, meaning the smoke that thunders, as much, if not more, than the Europeanized version. Near the falls, I got this portrait of a baboon and her infant. And for the first time that day, I caught more than very brief glimpses of monkeys. On the 17th of December, I made it here, Chitambo's village in northeastern Zambia, where Livingstone died and where his heart was buried. This 1903 notice in a US newspaper is helpful. So it's a monument to David Livingstone, explorer. The body of David Livingstone, the great explorer, is buried in Westminster Abbey. But the monument herewith illustrated was recently erected in memory of the famous Scotchman on the shore of Lake Bangweolo, Africa, near the spot where the explorer died 30 years ago. Beneath the monument is Livingstone's heart, which was not taken to England. Stanley found Livingstone in 1871, but Livingstone refused to return home and died 2 years later. So at the end there, it refers to Livingstone's famous encounter at a place called Ujiji in modern-day Tanzania, when Welsh-born US journalist Henry Morton Stanley is supposed to have uttered the immortal line, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume." At this point, it's important to highlight the role of Chuma and Susie. This is an abridged summary from a museum in Malawi. Chuma and Susie were Livingstone's faithful African companions and assistants. Livingstone freed James Chuma from slave traders when he was about 11 years old. From the day he was released, he regarded Livingstone as his family. Abdullah Susi joined the Zambezi expedition as a woodcutter. They travelled with Livingstone on his last journeys in East Africa. After Livingstone's death in Chitambo, Zambia, Chuma and Susie prepared the body for transport by removing his heart and burying it under a mavula tree, before carrying his body over 1,000 miles to the coast, where it was shipped to England for burial in Westminster Abbey. Now, this memorial plaque, I'll just read. David Livingstone, traveller, medical missionary, born March 19th, 1813, in Blantyre, Scotland, died here, May 1st, 1873, Chitambos village. Livingstone's birthday, the 19th of March, is the principal feast of St. Joseph. And 1st of May, when he died, is the feast of St. Joseph the Worker. And well, in Catholic tradition at least, all African missionary endeavours are said to be under the patronage of St. Joseph, because, conjuring up a familiar mental image, he brought the Holy Family to Egypt. English artist Frederick Goodall decided to leave nothing to chance in this late 19th century depiction, so you've got the pyramids and the River Nile. Part of Livingstone's reputation, incidentally, is that he had a fixation about finding the source of the Nile. But in an 1871 letter attributed to him in the New York Herald, he wrote, "If my disclosures regarding the terrible Ujijian slavery should lead to the suppression of the East Coast slave trade, I shall regard that as a greater matter by far than the discovery of all the Nile sources together." So anyway, with the St. Joseph connection, this is the Christmas card I put together this year. They're available in small packs of 5 with envelopes at the end. £5 for a pack, and all proceeds to Mary's Meals. So that's a medieval stained glass with a late 20th century David Livingstone. On the way back from Livingstone's monument, my excitement was off the charts when I finally got to see a chameleon, having been on the lookout for months. One thing I was able to do in Lusaka was pick up a kilt my folks had sent out. You can see a bit of tartan at the back of this luggage locker, and the other thing is a giant wooden spoon for stirring porridge, my Christmas gift to the Mary's Meals folks in Blantyre, Malawi. In Malawi and Zambia, Mary's Meals consist of a type of specially fortified porridge called likuni fala, sourced locally, as per Mary's Meals practice in all its project countries, enabling the local economy to benefit. This was me on Christmas Eve outside the Anglican Church of St. Michael and All Angels in Blantyre. I spent that morning and afternoon walking to the suburb of Chilamoni. My first view that day of St. James's Church, the parish where Mary's Meals originated in 2002. These are some of the guys who were running the Mary's Meals operation in Malawi in 2013. The elderly couple you can see there initiated and ran the very first school feeding program when Malawi was hit by a famine in 2002. More than 1 million Malawian children are now receiving Mary's Meals every school day, and the total is 2,429,182 children in 18 project countries worldwide. Some of the scenery in southern Malawi when I was there. Before heading home, I made one last pilgrimage to Nakota Kota on the shore of Lake Malawi. Here's a close-up of the sign. The Department of Antiquities, in memory of Dr. David Livingstone's arrival at Nakota Kota in 1861. He rested at the foot of this tree where he met Jumbe and other Chiwa chiefs and made a treaty with them to stop the slave trade. And the lake, known to many as Lake Malawi, though still called Lake Nyasa in Tanzania and Mozambique. Malawi's pre-independence name was Nyasaland. On New Year's Day 2014, I embarked on the first leg of my flight back to Europe with a connection from Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. The snow in this picture isn't quite as ridiculous as you might think. because as we flew over Kenya, you could see the snow-capped peak of Mount Kilimanjaro above the clouds. It is there, I promise. The patron saint of Paris, the final destination of my flight, is Saint Genevieve, and my short visit coincided with her feast day, the 3rd of January. I attended a service here at the Basilica of the Sacré-Cœur Sacred Heart in Montmartre, and later met up with some Parisians I'd met on the Camino for a typically Parisian crepe pancake supper. So that was Raiders of the Lost Ark. In case you're not convinced that Livingstone was anything like Indiana Jones, it's worth recalling how the character is introduced in the first film. Here he is hacking through the jungle in the company of local guides. However, his entire Spanish-speaking escort either runs away, tries to betray Indy, or even tries to kill him. There's a mistake I'd like to tell you about on page 123 of Amanda Mitchinson's Livingstone book. She makes out that the attendant who discovered that Livingstone had died, Majwara, thought of Livingstone as his master. He was not his master. In the 1880s, a newly arrived missionary called Alexander Heatherwick put on a magic lantern show with another of Livingstone's surviving aides in the audience. When a photograph of Livingstone appeared, there was great excitement as he leapt to his feet and exclaimed, "That's our chief, that's him." And that is the distinction. Livingstone was not their master, he was their chief. Researching this talk, I thought it would be useful to reread Missionary Travels and Researches in South Africa. However, the copy I've got is very old, with a note in the front saying it was given to a schoolboy as a prize in Chipping Sodbury in the 1860s. So instead of risking any damage to it, I thought I'd find the text online. I was surprised, however, that a lot of it was unfamiliar, and it's because the online version was the text of the first edition. Later editions, like the one I have, had lots of edits and abridgments. Before I finish, I'd like to highlight two short passages which I'd never read before. The first is this one. The universal effect of the diffusion of the more potent instruments of warfare in Africa is the same as among ourselves. Firearms render wars less frequent and less bloody. It is indeed exceedingly rare to hear of two tribes having guns going to war with each other. Obviously, so I've italicized that sentence. Firearms render wars less frequent and less bloody. Obviously, this didn't age well. Soon after Livingstone wrote these words, the American Civil War broke out, and of course, the 20th century was a horror show from this point of view. But I think this is instructive because it shows how easy it is to fall into the trap of thinking that just because weapons are powerful, no one will use them. In reality, even the most powerful weapons can, in fact, be used. That's why diplomacy and peacemaking efforts are so important. And finally, there's this passage in which Livingstone set out the rationale for Mary's meals. The general uncertainty of food and the necessity of frequent absence for the purpose of either hunting or collecting roots and fruits proved a serious barrier to the progress of the people in knowledge. Schools, e.g. in Scotland, would have been a failure had not the teachers wisely provided food for the body as well as food for the mind. As I say, more or less the rationale of Mary's meals. If children are at school and they're hungry, they can't learn, and they will not even go to school if they haven't got food. So that's why Mary's meals is the key way to lift children out of that kind of poverty, that desperate kind of poverty. Finally, here's that Liberian flag again. It's a hymn attributed to Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, to Mary, Stella Maris, the Star of the Sea. A friend of mine who died some years ago insisted that Mary, Star of the Sea, is the patron saint of Bristol, and for instance was the original dedication of St Mary Redcliffe. So I'll just read it. Look at the star, call upon Mary. With her as your guide, you shall not go astray. While invoking her, you shall never lose heart. If she walks before you, you shall not grow weary. If she shows you favor, you shall not grow. Thank you. Oh, yeah, thanks.
Are you okay to do?
Sure.
Can we have some lights on, please, so we can see? Thank you.
I think I probably went much too fast. I'm sorry about that. I went rather quickly, but anyway. All right. That person there.
Do you have any idea how Livingstone, as a single white man in Central Africa in the 19th century, could manage to persuade the local indigenous chiefs to have a treaty and stop the slave trade, which was presumably one of their main forms of income? I mean, the power imbalance seems so enormous with him with nothing to trade. How would he persuade them to do that?
It's a very good question. He knew the languages, and that's an important thing. I mean, he knew the languages, already had people with him who could communicate the message that he had about it. And now, how did he do it? His reputation went before him by that time. I mean, he really did have a reputation. He had a global reputation outside Africa, but within Africa as well. He was already very well known before he got to these places. And so, the Arab traders would have, some of them he actually relied on the Arab slave traders to get from certain places to other places. He seemed to have, on the whole, an incredible capacity for good relations with people of all kinds of different backgrounds, apart from probably his own Europeans and British. He got into really massive difficulties with them, but so that's part of the thing. He already had a reputation that would have been known to that chief, and he just. I mean, I think everybody in that part of Africa knew that there was something wrong. They just the amount of suffering and misery and death surrounding that trade was just horrific, absolutely horrific. So this is the kind of thing. I mean, it was, so from that point of view, to some extent, it was a kind of a moral weight of the argument. That would have been good. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
How many people in Africa now regard Livingstone? What's his legacy and what would their view of him be?
Right, it's a very good question. So the question was, what do people in Africa now think of Livingstone? On the whole, there is a very positive, he still has a very positive image. It's not universal. Obviously, there are some people who are not happy about the imperialist aspect of very obviously. But in Zambia and Malawi, for instance, Zambia still has one of its biggest cities, Livingstone, named after him. In Malawi, Blantyre is still named after his birthplace. Livingstonia is another place they have. They have a mountain range which is named after Sir John Kirk, who was an associate of Livingstone's. They have buildings and streets named after Livingstone in Malawi, and they haven't changed that. They've had lots of opportunities to change it. And I can also mention that just on Saturday, I had a few of these cards, and I happened to meet two people. They're kind of British Zambian, but they're Zambian British, and I thought I'll just give them a couple of cards, and I don't think it was my imagination when I said I got these cards and they've got a David Livingstone connection, and they were genuinely quite, you know, yes, right, well, I'd like to see that. Livingstone they are aware that there was a terrible human trade going on, and that Livingstone was instrumental in ending it. So from that point of view, it's not surprising. He's going to have a positive image. And actually, I could even say this, that the whole story of the British Empire is not necessarily great, but it is so much better because of people like Livingstone. I mean, it is a much more edifying story because of Livingstone and Wilberforce and others. But that's the kind of impression he has made. Mm. Sorry, yeah. Do I think that is his enduring legacy? Do you like that? Yes, I do. I think that is his enduring legacy in Africa, and it endures because, well, there are bound to be places in South Africa named after Nelson Mandela, but it is no more ridiculous to think that there'll be places in Malawi and Zambia named after Livingstone. That's how I would put it. And that's obviously, you know, a bit controversial, but that's how that's what I would say. Mm. Yeah.
Do you have a record of how much you walked, how much you flew, how much you did by taxi on this whole journey?
No, I'm afraid not. Yeah, so the question was about whether I've got a record of how much I actually covered, how much ground I covered in different ways, walking, or buses or bush taxis or aeroplanes. No, I'm afraid I don't. It was. I mean, I got through a pair of shoes, boots in France. I did cover a lot of ground, but it was actually, to be honest, it was mostly in Europe, on foot. Most of the ground I covered on foot was in Europe, and so, so that was the situation. Yeah, it was still unusual to go all the way across the Earth's surface from Scotland to Côte d'Ivoire. That's quite unusual, but it's not necessarily exactly the same as trekking to the North Pole or something. And it was a great privilege as well. I can mention I had a legacy from my grandfather, which made it possible. A great privilege to do this.
Any more questions, anybody?
Yep. Well, oh yeah, this was 2013, and no, I haven't done any really big ones since. No, nothing comparable to this. I've done a few walks, but no, nothing comparable to this. No, and there wouldn't be anything again like this. I don't think. No. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Oh, well, languages in Africa, French was very useful. Yeah, French, especially in West Africa, obviously. And then, of course, in Zambia and Malawi, I think virtually everyone is bilingual. So they have their native languages, but they speak English. And Zambia, in particular, you can go to quite Western feeling places in those countries. I mean, not to quite, as far as I'm aware, not to quite the same extent as in South Africa, which is very, very developed in places. But Zambia, the capital, Lusaka, reminded me more than anywhere else of Reading. It was yeah. So yeah, French though was very helpful in West Africa.
I hope it wasn't the same as the A&E department of Reading Hospital, which is a nightmare.
Okay. Yep, Barry, yeah.
Can I just ask about the role of football in your travels? I get the impression that because you know so much about football, it was the oil that made your journey much easier.
Well, actually, my football is a bit rusty, Barry, but it is useful. It is a language that you can use to communicate with people, and well, what can you say? It's absolutely phenomenally popular. I mean, it's just so incredible how popular football is. The number of Messi T-shirts, I mean, it is absolutely all over the place. You'd see them. And so it is very often a useful way of having a conversation with somebody to start talking about football. And the number of countries where you can't do that is just well, it seems to be very small, mind you. I haven't covered all the world, but at least in Africa, there are very few countries where you can't start talking about football. Yeah. Yeah.
Tell me a bit about what you ate.
I just tried to have basic stuff. I mean, if I say that, I didn't do too badly. What can I say? I mean, one of the problems is actually that my memory isn't that great. There were definitely foods that I had in Africa that I can't I never had before, and you would have a lot. Oh, I tell you what, one thing you get protein from is hard-boiled eggs. There's a lot of hard-boiled eggs, and there's quite a lot of peanuts in Africa as well, West Africa. But hard-boiled eggs are good for protein, and you buy them in that form. Otherwise, I mean, everywhere you could just get some form of bread or other, and try and get greens where they're available. There were these vegetables and fruits and things that, mangoes are important. I certainly definitely ate more mangoes than I had before. But apart from that, my memory isn't that great. I need to go back to my notes and find out what kind of thing I'd written there. But I didn't do too badly. I wasn't kind of starving ever. So that was obviously not. But yeah.
I'm rather more interested in the Mary's Meals places you visited, and also what was the main staple food that you made?
Oh yeah.
Was it based on maize or?
Gosh. That's a good question. I wish I should know. I just know it's called Lukuni Fala, so you're supposed to be just sufficiently impressed that I never know. But it is sourced locally, and then they bring in these fortified vitamins and minerals and things from. I think they bring them in Malawi. They bring them from South Africa. But it's good stuff, and it really it's the best meal that most of these children get. I mean, the vast majority of these children, the best meal they get on a school day is the meal they get in school. One thing I could mention is that in Blantyre, where it started, the level of development has actually gone beyond the need for Mary's Meals, which is what Mary's Meals wants everywhere, of course. So they don't have. I just heard this a couple of weeks ago. They no longer have Mary's Meals in Blantyre. And obviously that means that they can reprioritise to poorer communities elsewhere. because the focus is always on the communities that have the children who are excluded from school because of their lack of food.
Can I just say, it's, I mean, I've got two places like Liberia, for example, and I like Africa quite well. And when you're talking about Mary's meals, I'm just thinking about our school, you know, our meals here and the food banks here, and how important it is for children to get a hot meal, not in the schools or the own hot meals for children.
Yeah, absolutely. And showing the rustiness of my football, I can't remember the name of that Man United. Who's that Man United boy? Yeah, Rashford, right, Marcus Rashford. So Marcus Rashford, he obviously appreciated the same kind of thing. That's an issue everywhere. You can't have children in hungry. Hungry children are just not going to learn anything. Yeah, sorry, no. Well, I don't know if anyone else has a question.
So we take one more if anyone's got a burning question.
Elmo, you have a question? Oh, microphone. Is it not working?
Okay, probably.
Yeah, oh, sure.
So Mary's meal, if I heard you correctly, began in 2002,
Yeah,
and it's very strong. You said millions spread.
that's right. It grew out of an already existing humanitarian aid agency called Scottish International Relief, and then the first project started in 2002, and then it kind of took over the whole charity and became Mary's Meal. So there was one other question. Did somebody have? No. Yeah.
Slightly trivial. Which did you find more scary? Blantyre outside Glasgow.
Sorry, what was that?
Which was more scary, Blantyre. Blantyre near Glasgow.
The only place where I
Blantyre.
felt actually slightly threatened was in a pub in Blantyre, Scotland. It's true. It was a very sectarian pub, and they had these. I didn't look like it from the outside, but inside they had these pictures of, for instance, Paul Gascoigne playing his flute and that kind of stuff. And it's the only place where I thought, gosh, I'd rather not be here. I'd just gone in to get a glass of squash, some kind of refreshment, and but as it turned out, that was fine. But I survived, yeah. So,
Okay, James. Well, I just really like to thank you. You brought a sort of new dimension of wilderness lecture. It's like change from the rugby tufty, high mountains, deep seas, rough oceans. But the same things there, you experience all the things that people who go into these extreme environments experience. So it was a fascinating talk. Really appreciate it. So thank you very much.